It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, we're back on the political scene here today, and you know, you may have heard my recent podcast. I made a prediction actually on the 2020 Democratic presidential race, if you can imagine that. Now, it was meant to be a little bit out there because who can predict anything at this stage of the game? But I laid the foundation for the way that I'm looking at this, and I've gotten some criticism from folks that think I'm off base. Obviously, that's the nature of politics. But I'm looking online and I'm looking at articles, and I come across an article by Nicholas Powers in The Independent. And this guy is singing my song. I mean, I think he's picking it up the way that I'm putting it down. So I thought I got to get him on the podcast. And so Nicholas was good enough to come on with us to talk about his recent article in The Independent. And he's not from the heartland. He's way out east, way out in the Northeast. Good morning, Nicholas.
Hey, good morning, George. Thank you so much.
Well, welcome to the podcast by George, Live Line, as we call it. Now, I'm going to read just a little bit here from your article in The Independent dated September 7th to give people an idea of what got me interested in this. And it reads, in the 2020 presidential race, two candidates run from the left. Warren is a liberal technocrat brandishing detailed plans to fix the nation. She appeals to the middle and upper class. Sanders is a lifelong populist. Now, there's some terms here you need to become familiar with, folks, because they're critical. The difference between a technocrat and a populist. His political revolution attracts the young and the working class. The dividing line between them is Mathline Politics. Now, that's a new one on me. We're going to get Nicholas to explain a little bit about that. And for her, voting is pretty much the end of the people's role. For him, it's just the beginning. Now, one thing I would preface this with a little bit, I'm a big fan, Nicholas, of Tulsi Gabbard. People have heard me talk on the podcast about her before. I mean, you definitely put her on the left. She's just not a leading major candidate at this point, but on the left. Okay. All right, just wanted to clarify that because my wife and I are big fans of Tulsi Gabbard, obviously. So, I said on the podcast, it appears to me, or it looks to me like Elizabeth Warren is primarying Bernie Sanders for the progressive vote here in the run-up to the Iowa caucuses. They seem to be, again, singing the same song, but there are some differences here if you look closely, right?
Yeah, there's some vital differences between the two that have been glossed over by the high production value of the campaign, by the fact that Elizabeth Warren is a woman candidate who has perfect intellectual credentials. Also, the fact that as a woman candidate going against Trump, there's this kind of sweet aspect of revenge. And also her expertise compared to his buffoonery, Trump's buffoonery, is so exciting that it kind of glosses over some very, very, very deep differences between her and Bernie Sanders. And I think that those differences are very vital for people to understand as they kind of line up and get ready to vote or to at least start thinking about who to vote for.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I would say the vital difference is, as you mentioned before, the Mathline Politics. And, understandably, the term Mathline is probably foreign or strange to a lot of people. But when you unpack it, actually, it's kind of common sense. And the Mathline is basically a bottom-up or a grassroots form of political practice, where if you're an activist, you listen to the people. You actually sit down with them. You ask, what do you need? Who are you? Where are you coming from? What are the problems in your life? And you let the people air out their grievances. And as more and more people talk, inevitably what happens is that their problems begin to overlap. And they realize, it's not just me, it's us. It's not an individual issue that I can't afford health care or that my rent's too high or the gas is too high. Or that the schools are failing. It's not an individual issue. It's not just my fault. It's all of us are feeling the same thing. It's a system-wide problem. And so then people naturally, organically start coming up with solutions to their problems. And so the activists, their role is really to help organize and shape the natural ideas that people come up with into a blueprint for action. And as they move forward, whether it's electoral politics, whether it's direct action protest, they are constantly checking back and forth with the people to make sure that everyone's in agreement as they go forward. That's Mathline Politics. Basically, you check what's the line of the masses, what's their political line. And that's a very different political practice than top-down, which is, you know, an avant-garde party that has a ideology. Maybe it's Maoism, maybe it's Leninism, whether it's fascism. But it has a very pure ideology, and it says, no matter what you think or feel, the people, no matter what you think or feel, this ideology is more important. We have to follow this because this is the blueprint, not your experiences, not your life, these ideas. So it's very top-down. So Mathline Politics is inviting the people to be part of the solution. And so that's really where Bernie Sanders is coming from. He is a Mathline political guy. And that's a very, very different thing than what Elizabeth Warren is presenting herself as, because she has plans on plans on plans. And her plans are admittedly admirable, very good, but they don't really require the people to do more than voting. They vote for her, she's going to fix it. They vote for her administration, the team will be on it. Bernie wants you to get into the street. Bernie wants you to protest, to strike, to go on picket lines. He wants you to be part of a revolution rather than give your vote to someone else who's going to do the revolution on your behalf.
Now, he couldn't have made that more clear than his slug line, his theme for this 2020 run-up. It's not me, it's us. Isn't that what he's saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right there in the slogan. You can't get more clear than that.
Yeah. Well, you go on to say in the article that, and this is what I was getting to on my podcast, you're saying that Warren's doing a classic political triangulation between the center and left. You go on to write that she adopted Sanders' platform of Medicare for all, these policies that you spoke of, higher taxes on the rich and free college. In public, she seems in sync with Bernie, even hugging him at the debate. But behind the scenes, she calls Democratic National Committee members to reassure them she wants to lead them back to power. The DNC pulled for Clinton over Sanders in 2016. It voted down a single-issue debate on climate change and has been the centrist bulwark of the party for decades. Warren is signaling that her triangulation will fall back to the centrist position. Sure, we will get reforms. Sure, it will be a deep symbolic victory to have the first woman president, and I think that's key. The cost is the loss of Mathline politics that Nicholas was talking about, and the loss of a presidency that champions a working class movement. So again, that sums up the difference between kind of classic political behavior in the United States and Mathline politics. Because, I tell everyone that'll listen to me that this revolution that Bernie is talking about is going to require, bottom-up participation from the electorate. We all got to be a part of this. Bernie can't get this done even if elected, particularly with the Congress the way that it is, particularly with the Supreme Court the way that it is. It just ain't happening. Now, one departure from this a little bit is I tell folks that one arena, because of the way things have evolved in American politics, that we might have a dramatic change, maybe not a revolution, but a really dramatic change, is in the arena of international politics and affairs. The president has much more unilateral ability there when it comes to war powers and those types of things, and you might see that immediate influence with a Bernie Sanders presidency more quickly there. Would you agree with that?
It's possible. I mean, contrasted against Trump's really clumsy handling of international politics, instigating meetings and then withdrawing meetings, ripping up trade deals, being very crass and vulgar in interpersonal face-to-face meetings with people.
Yeah.
And, and all of those add up. I mean, people are people. And when you see someone who's very vulgar and crass and cartoonish, it has an effect on what happens on paper. And so one of the immediate effects is that Bernie, one, will restore a bit of dignity to the presentation of the United States abroad. We won't be a laughingstock. Two, that he's coming from a peace angle. He's coming from how to make peace, not war. And that's been his line for decades. And so hopefully I think he would pull back on the war machine that really began, honestly, today's date, September 11th, this war on terror that's been going on now. And it's become a kind of a self-momentum driving machine, leaving skeletons and ruined lives and ruined countries and weddings blasted apart by missiles, children without their parents, all across the globe. And this war machine has just been getting more and more power, more and more strength, and Trump has just been shoveling money at the Pentagon. So one of the first things I'd like to see is not only a worker-led movement to solve the problems of the people here in the United States, but a peace movement in the United States to pull back our war machine. And I would really hope that it inspires a peace movement around the world. I think that of all the money that is being spent on wars and building up the military throughout the earth, and how many people are starving, how many people are homeless, and how many people don't have medical care, it just seems a very lopsided and insane state of affairs. And so knowing that Bernie has been for peace for decades, he's been anti-war, one of the first things I'd like to see if he wins is a pullback of the U.S. war machine, and also maybe an awareness that this should not be normal. The state of affairs where millions of people around the world are living hungry, but then we have billions of dollars of war material, missiles and guns and tanks and airplanes, that is a very lopsided world to live in, and that we need to kind of rebalance it.
Yeah, the whole thing seems to be upside down, and I hope we can get back to some common sense, because the country has been indoctrinated basically to believe in this interventionist military machine that we have occupying places around the world. Let me just run by my thinking here, and I consider you to be much more of an expert in this than I am. But you correct me, tell me where I'm wrong. But this is the way that I'm looking at the campaign here in Iowa, and we've got another 6 months or so to go until the Iowa caucuses. But, I tell folks that I remember sitting on the couch watching the 2016 election the night before, and you probably remember this too, Hillary Clinton's last campaign appearance in Philadelphia. And the crowd was large. It just didn't seem to be that enthusiastic. Bruce Springsteen played. He just didn't seem to be that into it. And God, I love Bruce, and his choice of songs seemed to be kind of odd. And she took to the microphone, and Hillary took it upon herself to a couple of major themes that she made there on the last night before the election. One was this was an opportunity for every little girl in America to know that they can grow up and someday become president of the United States. And she did mention, Hillary did something about the gun lobby, about doing something about guns. I thought, oh my God, I turned to my wife and I said, she's going to lose. I mean, I don't think that's the theme that I would sound right now, particularly sticking my finger in the eye of the gun lobby right now before the election, as much as we'd like to do something about that. And, of course, she did go on to lose. So then, fast forward a little bit, and I'm looking at the 2020 election, which begins almost right away. I'm looking at all this Russiagate stuff, and honest to God, I don't care what anybody says. That appears to me to be the DNC's way of covering its tracks for its failure in 2016 by bringing up all these CIA spooks and FBI guys on MSNBC. I'm surprised that still lives on. Mueller has discounted that theory every which way but loose. There just doesn't seem to be any basis for it, but we continue to be inundated by this Russiagate crap. And then I'm looking at Warren and Bernie in these Iowa caucuses. And I don't want to go on too much of a soliloquy here with Nicholas on the line, but again, the way that I looked at this was she endorsed Hillary Clinton instead of Bernie, if folks remember, in the 2016 election. Came on board with Hillary first of all. She was embraced by the DNC. The DNC believes, again, if you remember what I said about Hillary, a lot of that was about getting the first woman president. And to speak critically of the DNC, I describe a lot of their hierarchy as being the Red Hat Society, Nicholas. It's older women in particular. And God love them, and I don't blame them, but they were looking at this, their last chance gasp maybe to get a woman elected. And they blame Bernie Sanders and his contingency for making that not happen. And they're sour about it. They're sour about it here in the state of Iowa particularly. We had a wide divide between Bernie voters and Hillary voters in 2016. 2016, and it's still there. And on the other side of the coin, you've got Bernie supporters that feel they got screwed. They got ripped off. They got cheated. It's pretty much been proven by WikiLeaks and other sources that was the case. They got cheated here in Iowa, particularly. Bernie won Iowa, basically, but because of 5 coin flips that all went Hillary's way in contested precincts, she won the Iowa caucuses. Okay, so these are the two people that are running from the left or leading from the left, as you mentioned in the article. So here, I'm going to wrap it up here and then tell people the bottom line on this. The way that I look at it is the DNC would like to have a centrist candidate. That's what they're about. They'd like to have one of these other folks, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, whoever it might be. That's who they would ideally like to have. There is a shift. There is a move in this country, primarily because of everything that Bernie brought with him to 2020 that looks like the Democratic Party is ready to make a move to the left. When they recognize that, the DNC is going to pull back and go, whoa, we hate Bernie. We don't like Bernie. He screwed us in 2016. He denied us the first female president. Wait a second. There is somebody that has progressive policies that is a woman, that is a Democrat, not a Democratic Socialist, but a Democrat that we can get behind and support in 2020. That makes Elizabeth Warren the nominee, not Bernie. And the Bernie people will not vote for Elizabeth Warren under any circumstances or any other Democratic candidate in 2020. These are the Bernie or bust folks. And there's a bunch of them. I mean, millions of them. I mean, Iowa is loaded with them. They're not going to go that way in 2020. If they don't, Donald Trump gets reelected in 2020. Okay, end of diatribe. Tell me what you make of that thinking, and tell me where I'm wrong.
I think the question is, do you want to be part of a revolution or not? Do you think a revolution is what we need? Political revolution is what we need both to save the country and to save civilization from the wreckage of climate change. If you do, then the choice is inevitable. The one who has the plan out there that meets that question is Bernie Sanders. And the corporate media slams the plan over and over and over again, which to me is a sign of how much they're afraid that Bernie could run away with the nomination. When they say that Bernie, the DNC, when you said the DNC is scared that any nominee would run to the left and lose the center, I actually think they're thinking about it in the wrong direction. People aren't necessarily running just towards the left. They're also running towards the bottom. Those who are poor, those who are lower middle class, those who are scraping by paycheck for paycheck, don't know what's going to happen with their kids' future. They're scared for themselves and for their families. Those are the huge masses of people. And that's why many of the working class are going with Bernie. And then there's a split. The upper and the middle classes are going with Elizabeth Warren because she, in a sense, offers them a revolution without a revolution. You can have deep structural change, but I'll take care of it. The technocrats will be the ones who deal with the change. And when we talk about the older generation of women and how furious they were at the Bernie Sanders campaign, saying that he blew our one chance to have a woman president in our lifetimes, I would suggest that they maybe talk to some of the younger working class women who were for Bernie, because younger working class or poor women looked at Bernie's policies and say, I need policies that actually address what I am going through rather than the symbolism of a woman in office. Does that symbolism matter? Yes. If I was a woman, I would feel an immense amount of pride to see a woman as president. But if her policies, aka Hillary Clinton or now Elizabeth Warren, if her policies didn't actually change my life, but Bernie Sanders' policies offered at least a chance for my life to become dramatically better, I'm going to choose real change over symbolism. And that's why a lot of working class women actually went for Bernie over Hillary. And now we're going to have to see if the same question is going to be there for Elizabeth Warren versus Bernie Sanders. Now, is Elizabeth Warren better than Biden? by miles. By miles.
Yeah.
Right? Is Joe Biden better than Trump? By miles. By miles. But if the only measurement of judgment is who's better than Trump, that's an almost infinite field. But if your judgment is the planet is on fire, there's too much carbon in the air, cities like Paradise, California are turning to ash, whole stretches of desert are growing, we have hurricanes that are smashing islands and turning them over like pancakes in the Caribbean, the Bahamas, tens of thousands of people are homeless, and this is just the first stage of climate change, and we're seeing it already in our lifetimes, then for me, the scale of measurement has to be whose policies will help the masses of people survive. And if they don't have policies that actually say that millions of people will be able to live, because we're going to change the economy from fossil fuels to renewable energies. We're going to make sure that workers have health care, good quality, low-cost housing, good schools for their kids, places for the elderly to retire and be cared for, hospice care. If we don't have someone with those policies, then, of course, we'll get rid of Trump, but we're not going to have the world that we really need, and we're going to muddle through once again. But I think ultimately the question is not really about the policies. It's not really about Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. I think the question really is for anyone who's listening, do you want to be part of a revolution? Do you want to change your life? Do you want to be part of a generation that other generations afterwards looks back upon and say, that was the turning point. They were the ones who got things started. We are grateful to them. The same way that we're grateful to the baby boomers for destroying the Nazi state, fighting the Nazis on the beaches of Normandy and winning so that we don't live in a totalitarian world under Hitler. Like the same way that we're grateful to the baby boom generation, or I'm sorry, the greatest generation, suppose it. Well, I would like a generation to look at us that way. And so at some point, all these policy questions are beside the point. We have to look in the mirror and say, am I a revolutionary? Am I willing to change my life, knowing what I know about how the world is going? And ultimately, that question is more important, really, than Elizabeth or Bernie Sanders. It's how you see yourself in the mirror.
My God, that's well said. I love this conversation. And I just looked at my clock. We're already a half hour into this thing, so I've got to wrap it up pretty soon, Nicholas. But I mean, that's spot on. I mean, and the other thing of it is with the younger people, and Bernie was just here this hitting the university tour, Iowa State, University of Iowa, and University of Northern Iowa this past weekend. He's telling everybody this youth vote is where it's at. And I think the younger people look at Bernie and they look at him as what they would call legit. And they look at some of these other candidates as people working within the system that aren't legit. So, I think he's got that going for him. And, I'd like to revisit this, maybe come back and talk about some of these other candidates. I'd like to talk about Tulsi Gabbard, but we're just out of time today. But I want to leave this, and you summed it up very well there, but is there any other final point that you'd like to make or something you'd like to get to that I didn't ask you about before we wrap up Podcast by George for this episode?
No, just look in the mirror, people. Look in the mirror.
That's it. Well,
yeah.
That's it. Yeah, and I tell people when it came to the 2016 election, I told them America has met its enemy, and it's in the mirror. It was then, but we can fix that. Look in the mirror and vote the conscience of America. I mean, vote for the future. That's great. Nicholas Powers, writer for The Independent, and a new friend, and I hope an ongoing consultant. Maybe we'll get back and talk to him here on future episodes, too. Good enough for coming on with us from out in New York. Maybe you picked that up from the accent. But that's it. News, blues, and interviews, a political conversation. And that's today's episode of another podcast by George.